It's been hailed as one of the century's most important archaeological finds, the body of a Bronze Age mountaineer, which scientists believe could be 4,000 years old. The corpse was discovered last week, frozen in the ice of a glacier on the Austro-Italian border. Since then, scientists have been supervising its removal. As well as the body, archaeologists have uncovered the remnants of clothing, special mountaineering equipment, and firelighting tools.
The face you have seen in every Ötzi the Iceman documentary, every textbook, every museum placard for the last 30 years is not his face. The man in that reconstruction has light skin, brown eyes, and a full head of dark wavy hair. The man who actually died in those mountains 5,300 years ago looked nothing like that. He was darker skinned. He was probably bald. And his DNA marks him as a genetic ghost, an outlier so unusual that he should not have existed at the time he died. The truth about Ötzi just changed, and the reason it changed is somehow worse than the lie. The body in the ice. September 19th, 1991. Two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, take a shortcut across a melting glacial gully in the Ötztal Alps. They see something dark in the ice. They think it is a discarded doll. It was not a doll. It was a human body. A man in his mid-40s, face down, freeze-dried by 5,300 years of dry alpine air. Skin still on the bones, hair still on the skull, teeth still in the jaw. His copper axe lay near his hand. Arrows lay scattered around him.
Whoever shot him went up and pulled the arrow shaft out of his back. Why would you do that? Why would you take the arrow away?
Workers arrived. They had no idea what they were touching. They pulled him out with jackhammers and ski poles. No gloves, no protocols. Hands all over the body, the leather, the weapons. The clothing tore, the bow snapped. By the time real archaeologists understood what had been found, dozens of people had already left their fingerprints on the most important corpse in European prehistory. That detail does not seem to matter yet. It will matter more than anything else in this story. The artifacts around him were extraordinary. A nearly pure copper axe head, hafted to a yew wood handle with leather and birch tar. Proof that Copper Age alpine communities knew metallurgy more advanced than anyone expected. His body carried 61 tattoos, parallel lines and crosses inked at his joints and along his spine. The placement matches acupuncture points used in traditional Chinese medicine, a therapeutic system that supposedly developed thousands of miles away and thousands of years later. Either two cultures stumbled onto the same anatomical map independently, or there is a far older medical tradition nobody has fully traced. His stomach still held his last meal. Ibex meat, red deer meat, einkorn wheat, bracken fern. He had eaten within hours of dying. The world wanted to know who he was. The body could not speak. The artifacts could only hint. So the world asked his DNA, the face the world built from his genome.
This is very bad for the DNA preservation. On the other hand, he was frozen for more than 5,000 years, and this turned out to be good because the coldness preserves the DNA.
In 2012, a team led by Andreas Keller and Albert Zink published the first full genome of Ötzi the Iceman in Nature Communications. It was the highest quality ancient genome ever recovered from human remains that old. The findings were celebrated worldwide. The study said Ötzi belonged to Y chromosome haplogroup G2A, a lineage tied to the early Neolithic farmers who had spread into Europe from Anatolia beginning around 7000 BC. He was a descendant of farmers, not the older hunter-gatherer populations that occupied Europe before agriculture arrived. He carried a mix of Anatolian farmer and European hunter-gatherer ancestry, the same blend that defines most modern Europeans today. The genetic markers told researchers more. He probably had brown eyes. He probably had light skin, the kind of pigmentation that farming populations developed as they pushed north into weaker sunlight. He fit neatly into the European story. He looked, the data said, like a darker version of the people who would walk through the museum to see him. The South Tyrol Museum of Archaeology in Bolzano built the famous reconstruction from those findings, a life-size model of a man with light skin, brown eyes, and a full head of dark wavy hair. The reconstruction artists Alphonse and Adri Kennis, working from the genome data, sculpted what was supposed to be the most scientifically accurate face of any prehistoric human ever displayed. Every line on the face was justified by a genetic marker. Every pigment was justified by a paper. That model went into every documentary, every textbook, every educational poster about prehistoric Europe. Tourists posed next to it, children learned from it, National Geographic featured it. The face became one of the most reproduced images of any single ancient individual on the planet. Almost everything about that face was wrong. The Iceman has been studied more intensively than any other prehistoric human in history. CT scans, tooth isotope analysis, stomach content, reconstruction, pollen identification, tattoo cataloging. His intestinal bacteria were sequenced. The Helicobacter pylori strain in his gut matched South Asian populations rather than modern European ones, hinting at disease ecology nobody had predicted. His final hours were forensically profiled down to the minute. And yet, for 11 years, no one realized the basic portrait was a fake, the 10% that broke everything. In August of 2023, in the journal Cell Genomics, an international team led by Frank Meixner of Urec Research in Bolzano and Johannes Krause of the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology published a complete high-coverage resequencing of Ötzi's genome. The first author was K. Wang. The new sequencing used technology that did not exist in 2012. Contamination protocols had been refined for a decade. They went back to the source samples and ran everything again. The result was devastating.
The mummy, because we detected about 3 years ago that the stomach is still preserved and it was still filled with material. So we wanted to know in this project whether, on the one hand, what was his last meal composed, but also whether there's still bacteria preserved in his stomach.
Approximately 10% of the sequence reads in the 2012 study were not Ötzi's DNA at all. They were modern human DNA. Contamination from the people who had handled his body without gloves in 1991. From the dozens of researchers who had taken samples through the 1990s, from every touch deposited on the most studied mummy in the world. 10% does not sound catastrophic. In ancient DNA work, 10% is a flood. Ancient DNA is fragile. After 5,000 years in the ice, what survives is not a clean strand of genetic code. It is a debris field. Short, broken fragments mixed with bacterial DNA, fungal DNA, and most dangerously, DNA from every modern human who ever touched the sample. The 2012 team knew this. They applied the best contamination filters available at the time. Statistical models flagged the most obvious modern reads and stripped them out. They thought they had a clean genome. They did not. The contamination protocols of 2012 could catch the loud noise. They could not catch the whispers. Subtle modern reads, fragmented in ways that mimicked ancient damage, slipped through the filters and got stitched into the sequence. For 11 years, those whispers sat inside the published genome of the most famous mummy in history, and nobody noticed. And the contamination was not random. The modern DNA came from Europeans, people whose own ancestry profiles included significant Western hunter-gatherer and steppe-related components. When that modern signal mixed with Ötzi's actual ancient signal, it pulled his genome in a specific direction. It made him look more European. It made him look more like the people studying him. It made him look like the wrong man. If the museum could be wrong about a face the whole world has memorized, the question is no longer whether other reconstructions are wrong. It is which ones. Hit subscribe now and stay with this, because what the corrected genome actually shows is harder to swallow than the contamination itself. The real Ötzi. Strip the modern contamination out, and a different man appears. Ötzi's actual ancestry is approximately 91% derived from early Anatolian Neolithic farmers. That figure is staggering.
Has he been in a battle? Has he already been fighting for his life? There's some evidence that would lead to that interpretation.
By 3230 BC, when Ötzi died, most European populations were already heavily mixed. The Anatolian farmers who had spread across the continent over 4,000 years had intermarried with indigenous hunter-gatherer groups. Their descendants carried roughly equal parts of both. Ötzi did not. His genome shows almost no Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, and it shows zero-step ancestry at all. That zero is the most important number in the entire 2023 study. Around 3000 BC, roughly Ötzi's lifetime, populations from the Pontic-Caspian steppe began pouring into Europe. These steppe peoples, the Yamnaya, would rewrite the genetic landscape of the continent within a few centuries. Their DNA would soak into populations from Iberia to Scandinavia. They brought new languages, new technologies, new burial traditions. Modern Europeans carry substantial steppe ancestry. It is one of the defining markers of who Europeans are. Almost every person watching this video has it in their genome. Ötzi has none of it. His genome is a snapshot of a population that had not yet been touched by the migration that was about to redraw Europe. He came from an isolated alpine community that had stayed unmixed for thousands of years while the rest of the continent was scrambling its DNA. The Alps were a refuge. He was a holdout. The mountain valleys had walled his ancestors off from the demographic chaos sweeping the lowlands, preserving a genetic profile closer to the original Neolithic farmers than to anything alive in Europe today. He was one of the last of his kind. His skin was the next thing to fall. The 2012 study said he probably had light skin. The 2023 study said the opposite. Ötzi carried genetic variants for significantly darker pigmentation than any museum reconstruction shows. The fair-skinned Iceman was a contamination artifact. The modern European DNA mixed into his samples carried the light skin variants of contemporary Europeans. Pull the contamination out, and the real pigmentation surfaces. Darker than every model, darker than every painting, darker than every documentary recreation. This finding lines up with everything researchers now know about ancient European pigmentation. The light skin that defines modern Europeans only became widespread in the last 5,000 years, around or after Ötzi's lifetime. The selective pressure for lighter skin was still working in his time. Earlier European populations, including the Anatolian farmers who were Ötzi's primary ancestors, often carried variants for darker pigmentation that the modern European population has since largely lost. He had not finished the journey. He was a man caught mid-transition, on the wrong side of an evolutionary line that his descendants would eventually cross. Then came the hair. Ötzi carried strong genetic markers for male pattern baldness. He was in his mid-40s when he died. He was almost certainly already balding, possibly significantly so. The full head of dark wavy hair on the museum model is not his hair. The man who walked into those mountains 5,300 years ago was probably bald or balding on top, with darker skin than any European reconstruction has shown, with an ancestry profile that marked him as a genetic outlier, even among his contemporaries. Take all three corrections together, and the museum reconstruction is not a slightly inaccurate portrait. It is a different man. The skin is wrong, the hair is wrong, the ancestry that shaped his face is wrong. The only thing the wax model gets right is roughly the age and the build. The Iceman the world has stared at for 30 years is a fiction. The murder nobody caught for a decade. The reconstruction got the face wrong. The original investigators got something else wrong too. They missed how he died. For 10 years after the discovery, the cause of death stayed open. Exhaustion, exposure, a fall. The mummification made the trauma hard to read. Then, in 2001, an X-ray caught what every previous examination had missed. A flint arrowhead. Lodged deep in his left shoulder, the arrow had entered from behind. It severed a major artery. The wound would have killed him in minutes. Ötzi had been shot in the back and left to bleed out in the snow. CT scans in 2007 found more. Blunt force trauma to the head, possibly inflicted shortly before or after the arrow strike. The violence around his death was not accidental. It was finishing work. Then the blood evidence came in. Forensic analysis of his weapons and clothing identified DNA from 4 different individuals. None of it was his. 4 other people had bled on his equipment. 4. Ötzi had fought somebody, or several somebodies, before he died. He had wounded multiple attackers. Then somebody put an arrow in his back from behind and walked away. Whoever shot him took the arrow shaft with them. They left only the buried head. Isotope analysis of his teeth and bones tracked his last journey. He grew up in the Isaac Valley region of South Tyrol. In his final months, he was living in the lower Vinschgau Valley. He died high in the mountains, in a pass between what are now Austria and Italy. He was not on a casual climb. Somebody followed him up there. Somebody wanted him dead badly enough to chase him into the snow line. They got what they came for. He bled out in the ice. The ice held him for 5,300 years, and the murder weapon is still inside his shoulder. What else is wrong? The implications are larger than one mummy. The 2023 resequencing did more than correct one face. It exposed a structural problem in early ancient DNA work. Ötzi was the most studied prehistoric human ever examined. Every protocol, every check, every safeguard available in 2012 was applied to his samples, and 10% of the data was still wrong. If the most carefully handled ancient genome in the world was contaminated, what about the others? Ancient DNA exploded as a field in the 2000s. Hundreds of ancient individuals were sequenced. Migration maps of prehistoric Europe, Asia, and the Americas were redrawn based on those genomes. Textbook narratives of who moved where and when were rewritten in real time. Museum reconstructions across the world were updated to match. How many of those genomes were also corrupted by modern contamination? How many of those faces are wrong? How many migration stories taught in undergraduate anthropology courses right now are based on data with the same kind of invisible noise that warped Ötzi for over a decade? Johannes Krause, senior author on the 2023 paper, runs the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology. His own institute produced many of the foundational ancient DNA studies that reshaped modern prehistory. He is not an outsider critic. He is the field looking at its own work from 10 years ago and admitting the data was dirtier than anyone realized. When the man who helped build modern ancient DNA research signs his name to a paper saying the foundational data needs to be redone, that is not a footnote. That is the discipline starting to question its own backbone. The Ötzi resequencing is not closure. It is a warning shot. The South Tyrol Museum will need to update its reconstruction. The fair-skinned, full-haired Iceman that has greeted visitors for 30 years does not represent the man whose body lies in the climate-controlled chamber down the hall. The real Ötzi had darker skin, was probably balding, and descended almost entirely from Anatolian farmers who had gone unmixed in the Alps, while the rest of Europe scrambled together a new population. Within centuries of his death, the steppe migrations would erase the genetic world he came from. The unmixed alpine farming communities would be absorbed. The pattern Ötzi represented would disappear from Europe. He was not just a man frozen in ice. He was a man frozen at the exact moment his entire population was about to be wiped from the genetic record. He was one of the last of his kind, and for 30 years, even his face was not allowed to be his own. The face in the room. Picture the museum in Bolzano right now. In one chamber, behind climate-controlled glass at -6 degrees Celsius, the actual body of Ötzi the Iceman lies preserved, darker skinned than any model has shown, probably bald, the DNA of a vanished population still locked inside him. He is alone in there, just him and the ice that has held him for 5,300 years. In the next chamber, his wax reconstruction stares out at tourists, light-skinned, full head of dark wavy hair, brown eyes that match the genome, but a face that does not. Children take photos with the wax man. Parents read placards next to him. School groups file past. They learn the wrong face. Every one of them walks out of that museum carrying a memory of a man who never existed. The body and the model are a few meters apart. They are not the same person. They have never been the same person. How many other museums are doing this right now? How many other ancient reconstructions built on early 2010s DNA work are showing the wrong skin, the wrong hair, the wrong ancestry to a public that has no way of knowing? The Neanderthals reconstructed for natural history exhibits, the Bronze Age warriors in glass cases, the Egyptian pharaohs whose pigmentation has been reconstructed from degraded samples, the early Americans whose ancestry maps were drawn from a handful of contaminated genomes. Which of those faces are real, and which are contamination wearing a face? Ötzi got resequenced because he is famous enough to justify the cost. Most ancient individuals will never be resequenced. Their first genome will be their only genome. Whatever errors crept in during early ancient DNA work will stay in the record forever, attached to faces in museums, taught to school children, printed in textbooks, repeated in documentaries. Somewhere in a museum near you, there is probably a face that is not the face it claims to be. If the contamination rewrote Ötzi after 30 years, which museum reconstruction do you think falls next? Drop it in the comments. Then hit subscribe, because the next video looks at another ancient genome that researchers are quietly admitting they may have read wrong, and the implications go further than one frozen man in the Alps. The Iceman is still in the ice. The wax model is still in the next room. They are still not the same person. They never were.